to award you the Rivers Memorial Medal for 2022. And I believe you're going to give us maybe 10 minutes or so of a little talk. So there we are. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much, Sue. And I must say, I'm extremely flattered to have been awarded the Rivers Medal. It was completely unexpected, of course, and I'm extremely honoured that the RAI have selected me for this award. So thank you very, very much. So as Sue said, I am going to talk for about 10 minutes, and at the risk of repeating everything you said, and probably in a much less intelligent manner, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to basically just talk a little bit about my research career and its kind of highlights, I suppose, and its main focuses through the lens of a lot of my publications, and particularly the books that I've written around this. And I think it does help, and Sue kind of gave a little biography about me. I think it does help to understand my research interests in the context that my career in archaeology has taken. It very much began as a teenager in London. I was living in London, and where I started volunteering as excavations to the Department of Greater London Archaeology, which is now part of the Museum of London Archaeology. So I basically spent several summers excavating in various sites in London before I started my formal education at the Institute of Archaeology, where I gained my BA in archaeology. And then I went back into field archaeology, professional archaeology. Before starting my PhD in Cambridge, I worked with the Cambridge County Council Archaeology Department for about a year, again doing very, very similar kind of work in development-led archaeology. And after 4 or 5 years of my PhD, I went back into professional archaeology, working for the Cambridge Archaeological Unit for 6 years. And then my move to Iceland happened in around the turn of the millennium to take up a research position, but also getting involved in development-led archaeology in Iceland. And then finally, almost needed the push, I ended up in an academic position about 15 years ago at the University of Iceland, which is where I've been since. And since that time, my involvement in, at least in commercial or contract archaeology has been massively reduced, if not gone. Now, the point of, I suppose, of that biographical sketch is that I think it partly explains why these kind of key, one of the key running threads throughout my career, which has been this examination of archaeology as a field practice, as a mode of knowledge production, as a way of engaging with the remains of the past. Now, my first book that came out a few years after my PhD, Critical Approaches to Fieldwork, was very much an exploration of archaeology as a practice, as a field practice, and how that intersects with the other aspects of the discipline, and particularly also how it interacted with the theoretical developments that had happened in archaeology, particularly since the 1950s and 1960s. And since then, I've been kind of developing these ideas and developing this focus on archaeological practice, what it is we do as archaeologists, and some of the issues that emerge from that. And a lot of this has culminated in a book that just came out recently last month, Archaeological Situations, which you mentioned, which is a kind of like a new theory primer for undergraduates, but it's very much focused on what if we examine archaeological theory from the point of view of practice and as I define it, theory from the inside out. So that in a way is a sense that the culmination of perhaps the last 20 years of my research focus on this. Because it also kind of brings up this aspect of theory as well, as really crucial to archaeology, to its practice, not as something esoteric, abstract, and something which you can do as an option, which is what it was like when I first started archaeology in the 1980s. So theory runs through all my research as much as the focus on archaeological practice. And it's perhaps this other side of the coin. And just as in my teens, when I started archaeological fieldwork, like many people, I also started to get into philosophy. I don't think it ever occurred to me to take up philosophy as a topic at university. It was perhaps, I was much more engaged by the physicality of archaeology and the empirical, if you like. But at the same time, it's kind of been this recurrent thread throughout my work, and theoretical archaeology has been, I suppose, one of the defining features there too. Now, there's a certain irony, I suppose, and I think Sue mentioned it as well, between this kind of contrast between the very concrete physical and practical aspect of archaeology, particularly archaeological fieldwork, and theory, which is typically associated with something very abstract and cerebral and far removed. And joining these two fields has been, I suppose, the dynamo, the motor that's kind of fed my research interest throughout the last 20, 25 years. A large part of the intersection of theory and practice has been focused on, as I said, what we do as archaeologists, field work, but also on what comes on after field work, the writing process, which is something I explored in one of my recent books, Writing the Past. But a part of it is also focused on the nature of the archaeological. What is the archaeological? What is the nature of the material nature of archaeology and the materiality of the past? And this is something that first started to explore 10 years after my first book, in a book called Understanding the Archaeological Record, where again I tried to partly focus on the relationship between archaeological fieldwork and practice and the archives and records and concepts which we produce through that, but also particularly about what it is about archaeological remains that so engages us, and how that links to our understanding of the past and what is the nature of the past is. So this brings up this other big topic in my career, which is the nature of time in archaeology. And time was the topic of my PhD. When I did in Cambridge under Ian Hodder, my whole focus was on the concept of time, which was also very popular perhaps around that time as well. And this culminated in one of my first books on time, The Archaeology of Time, which was in some sense a kind of introduction to the set of issues and the set of problems that archaeologists have been discussing perhaps at that time in the last 10, 15 years, and trying to kind of make time a theoretical concept as opposed to just a problem of dating. This is a theme which I picked up in a book that was a kind of, wouldn't say a second edition, but more like a sequel to that book, Making the Time, which I published last year, I think, which was trying to take a more personal view of the nature of time in archaeology, but also working on the debates and the material that's been discussed since the first book came out. Now, I don't want to go into any depth about this, but I suppose in a nutshell, my approach to the concept of time in archaeology might be summed up thus. Instead of viewing archaeology as a means purely to understand the past or what happened in history or prehistory, I want to know how the archaeological is implicated in the very structure of time itself. Sounds like a very philosophical point of view, but in a sense, that's partly the point. What can archaeology actually bring to a very, very abstract philosophical discussion such as about time? So rather than think of what philosophy can bring to archaeology, turn it upside down. What can archaeology actually bring to the philosophy of time? But since I don't just like to reflect on archaeology, but also I like to do it, I want to just end by mentioning this other aspect, that although a lot of my work is focused on the relationship between practice and theory, I have also been engaged a lot in of course, very, very practical field work myself. And although my PhD looked at prehistory, most of my work has been on historical archaeology, later historical or post-medieval archaeology. Now, although I've worked on various sites around the world, Çatalhöyük in Turkey, Iron Age sites in Italy, sites in Britain, and projects in South Africa and so on, it has been this kind of archaeology of the recent past that's been my main focus since finishing my PhD. And I suppose part of this turn happened around the same time as I finished and one of my first books came out. I also co-edited a volume with Victor Buckley, who's now, of course, in the Anthropology department at UCL, called The Archaeology of the Contemporary Past. And this was about exploring a range of different issues, partly a call for a theoretical reflection on the nature of what the archaeological is and time, and part a call for extending the methodologies of archaeology to the present, to the contemporary era, not something that just applies to the past. And it was kind of that kick-started my interest. And although I haven't done much work in what's now known as contemporary archaeology or field contemporary archaeology, which is a big blossoming subfield, I should now mention, I went on to run a project in South Africa for a few years, looking at Dutch colonialism, and published a book on that called The Archaeological Colonial Identity, but then moved to Iceland, and that's where all my work's basically been focused over the last 15 years or so. And I should say that my work in Iceland is partly driven by a perverse desire to do something that wasn't the Vikings, which is almost what all my colleagues in Iceland focus on. And in a sense, putting historical archaeology and later historical archaeology on the agenda there has been something which has been a big drive for me working in Iceland. So I'm not sure why I was driven from prehistory towards historical archaeology. And of course, I still follow what goes on. But in my memory, it partly relates to the richness of historical sources and what they can bring to archaeology. But I think in some ways, this being drawn to archaeology of the recent past has a much deeper root, perhaps in my earliest experiences of working in urban archaeology in London, which was, after all, working mostly on Roman sites, medieval sites, or post-medieval sites in London. And I certainly remember it was a big shock to me around the same time in the 1980s when I went to work on my first prehistoric site, which was a Mesolithic camp on Hampstead Heath. The two were completely different worlds, working in central London and working on Hampstead Heath on two very different sites. And ultimately, I think I was far more interested in the world that was closer to my own and today. And I still remain drawn to trying to understand how processes such as capitalism, colonialism, industrialization, or even the Anthropocene articulated through the materiality and temporality of the archaeological record of the last 5 centuries. So if my interest in connecting archaeological practice with theory has been the dominating focus, I've also tried to use this in the service of understanding the history of the material conditions which frame the present within which I live and work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed. That was just fascinating, and I understand now why we never quite may see the subject through the same light again, looking at the work that you've done. Thank you for that. Professor Bugg, I wonder if I could ask you to come forward and perhaps talk to us a little bit about the Marsh medals, please. Are you okay there? It's a long way away, I'm sorry. Okay. Mind that cable. There we go. Entirely up to you. Why don't you do everything now?
I'll do this first. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here again. It feels quite different to sitting in our upstairs bedroom and talking to you from there. My name is Rod Bugg. I'm coming here today representing the Marsh Charitable Trust. We have the fortunate task of being able to provide a little bit of money to people who've done exceptional work in all sorts of organizations, to recognize the exceptional contribution that individuals make in a number of fields. We were established in 1981 as a grant-making body by Brian Marsh, who remains our chairman today. And over the past 35 years, the Trust has developed an award scheme to provide recognition to those people who work to improve the world we live in. Recipients of the Marsh Awards are always people who make a difference by selflessly contributing their efforts in areas that they believe in passionately. The awards are run in partnership with the Royal Anthropological Institute form part of a larger scheme of 80 awards that the Trust runs in partnership with other organisations, spanning areas of heritage, social welfare, the arts, conservation and scholarship. The Marsh Award for Anthropology in the World has been presented since 2014 and recognises a person who has applied anthropology to the better understanding of the world's problem. The Lucy Mair Medal and the Marsh Prize have been presented since 2016, and these awards honour excellence in the application of anthropology to the relief of poverty and distress and to the active recognition of human dignity. This year's awardees are, as ever, quite outstanding, and having read the citations, I'm very much looking forward to hearing a little bit more from each of the awardees, as we've just heard. And now I think my task is to invite each of the awardees to come forward.
I'll just give a little bit of a background on each of them, if
That
I
would
may.
be excellent.
So
Thank you very
why
much. So if I just stand aside.
You don't have to move too far.
No, it's okay, I'll stand.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay,
perfectly.
thank you, as long as you're happy. So, first of all, the Lucy Mair Marsh Medal for 2022. This was the first time that I ever had any involvement with the RAI when I was honoured to be given this medal. And so it's a huge pleasure today to be able to pass it on to what I probably think is one of the kindest, most compassionate, nicest, most learned, most relied upon people that the Royal Anthropological Institute knows, Professor Raymond Apthorpe. The Lucy Mair Medal of the Royal Anthropological Institute is given to those who devoted themselves to applied anthropology, with particular reference to the pursuit of human dignity. Professor Raymond Apthorpe, who is currently approaching his 90th year, but that's not possible. You don't look a day over 21. It's just a number. It's just a number. He's devoted his life to international development and humanitarian assistance programs at the highest level, while simultaneously teaching with the utmost sympathy and care, having held chairs or visiting professorships in many universities across the world. He studied for his DPhil in social anthropology at the Institute of Anthropology at Oxford, after which he took up a position at the University of Makerere, where he became Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. There he played an active role in supporting African independence movements, whilst at the same time being asked to become a founding delegate of the Second Biafra-Nigeria peace talks in 1968. From 1969 to 1970, he was Director of Research for African Studies in Geneva before moving to UNDP, where from 1970 to 72, he was Director of Social and Community Training in Taipei. From 1972 to 74, he was UNDP Project Manager and Visiting Professor for Development Sociology at the Institute of Planning, the University of the Philippines, Manila, and from where he moved to become Professor of Development at the University of East Anglia. From 1977 to 86, he was Professor of Sociology and Social Anthropology of Development at the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. And subsequently, he became, from 1987 to 93, the UNDP Chief Technical Advisor to the Academy of Planning and Development for the Government of Bangladesh. And from 1990 to 94, Team Leader for Evaluation of Swedish Humanitarian Relief in the Horn of Africa. And from 98 to 99, Chief Technical Advisor to AusAid's Papua New Guinea Drought Response Programme. He then became Visiting Professor for Graduate Studies and Development Administration at the National Centre for Development Studies in Canberra, in Australia. Followed in the 1990s, he's been a busy chap, by becoming a founding fellow or otherwise a leader in a series of initiatives devoted to increasing capacity in our understanding of the efficacy of human intervention, including being a founder of ALNAP, that's the Active Learning Network on Accountability and Performance in Humanitarian Action. Throughout his 80s, he remained an active participant or lecturer in universities in Britain, Norway, and Australia, teaching in numerous master's courses on development and humanitarian studies, approaching each student, whatever their background, with the utmost sympathy and consideration. Frequently, he would ask no payment for these roles. And to each interaction or intervention, he would bring a lifetime's professional experience, one bolstered by an equally measured and thoughtful intellectual understanding. The above is only a very brief summary of the extraordinary variety and richness of his immeasurable contribution in enhancing capacity in humanitarian intervention, touching not only upon the lives of those most affected by disaster, but also on multiple generations of students in 4 continents. There truly could be no more fitting a recipient of this award, and it is with great pleasure that we now invite Professor Apthorpe to receive the Lucy Mair Medal and Marsh Prize.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Would you like to say a few words, Richard?
Not really. I think I ought to thank.
Raymond, I've met a couple of Richard.
How did you hide your embarrassment when you are held up and discussed in this way?
I'm going to pop that in the box here, Raymond.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it's, oh,
There's a whole plethora.
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Perhaps it's a good thing. I was going to give make a few remarks about the subject.
Please.
Is that all right?
Of course it is.
Whether I should be able to remember.
Would you like to come to the lectern, and then
Yes,
people,
yes.
people on
Would
the,
you like to take this?
and then people on the camera can see you, Raymond, because you're online as well.
Oh, good. Yes, I will. I'm feeling better now. It was getting here that brought on the temperature again. I just had a couple, like everybody else, a couple of difficult weeks. And yesterday at the Institute, we had 14 very active researchers from 4 East African countries. And we just went at it for 3 hours. And I think probably that was a little bit, I probably came out a little bit too early for that. Anyway, yeah, perhaps I won't, I do have a speech here, but let me, I'll try and remember it. I'll try and remember the main point. At least that way it'll be shorter. But first of all, I'm really extremely grateful. I almost didn't accept the award, but I did because of my respect for the Institute, yourself, and the committee. I'm a member of that committee. And imagine how embarrassing it was to suddenly hear that one's committee had given, or was about to give, a member of the committee, a serving officer of the Institute, an award. And that was why I was extremely embarrassed. And also, longevity, does have its advantages, but it shouldn't really mean that therefore you get all these lovely awards. But anyway, I really do appreciate it, and I got over my embarrassment, and I'm very happy to have it. Thank you. I mean, Lucy Mair would probably not have agreed. We had different views. Audrey Richards would have done, but not Lucy Mair. She was a very strong-minded person, and she thought when I was hosting her in the Kerry in 1960, she thought I had completely lost my way already, and she wrote me off completely. Audrey Richards took another view. She was another visitor we had. You've got a lot of education, Raymond. What on earth are you going to do with it? Was her comment. Anyway, what I did with it, I became the honorary secretary of the Institute, and I've had an absolutely fantastic time here. Thank you, everybody, particularly the director and Amanda and everybody. Although I'm about to stand down, I think it is next year. There's a constitutional requirement that I have to give a proper notice. So I think we're going to have the proper notice given at the next council meeting. Oh, now, all that said, I did think I'd like to say a few words just about humanitarian and development studies, because that's the area that finally got involved heavily in, and I'm still involved in. And what is it really about? It's really about intervention to hope to aid across international borders. And it's in the name of humanity. It's in the name of human dignity. And it's also in the name that it's better to give than to receive. That's a theoretical, but also a theological. It's also in the name, did I say that, of human dignity? And in this building, with all its history, it's lovely to have just a moment to say something about human dignity. And I think what we would associate this building with, and what I also believe strongly myself, is that neither killing or being killed has anything to do with human dignity. I'm thinking of all the wars going on around the world, and I'm thinking of I'm thinking of how many efforts have been made to, through international law and elsewhere, to kind of mollify somehow war. But funnily enough, and I've interviewed lots of senior military people over the years, but one said to me, yes, Raymond, we are defending democracy, but we're not practicing it. I mean, that's something you have to cope with. That is the military, defending it, not practicing it. And one thing they were not practicing, even secretly for their own internal purposes, was how many casualties or mortalities they were causing. And at first I thought this must be inside information that exists, but they don't want to reveal. But I met and interviewed so many people. I was lucky to do that. That was where longevity helped a bit, actually. And I came to the conclusion that no, there aren't any such inside their lists. Now, this is, when you think about it, is shocking. And I think there's no Geneva Convention at the moment, which, or ever has been, that would insist that at least a record is kept of the mortalities and casualties caused in the name of humanity, in the name of human dignity, and in the name of it's better to give than to receive. Now, you'll see my point, really. There's a problem I have with each of those concepts. And to start with the in the name of humanity, it does trickle off the tongue rather well. But crimes against humanity are committed by humanity. So what does it mean to intervene across international borders in the name of humanity to aid? The more you think about it, it's a very, 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 very confusing concept, which doesn't help either to understand, I think, the actual institution we're talking about, or to improve its track record. And I think the same is the case with the concept of compassion. Compassion is such a universalistic, sort of completely all-engrossing concept. It crowds out accountability. The important thing is to be compassionate, not to be accountable as well, or not to seek to be accountable, particularly to the affected populations. But when that happens, if that is the effect of the powerful concept of compassionate and compassion, that it crowds out accountability to the people you're supposed to be trying to help, there's obviously something wrong with that concept somewhere. So I have that problem, even with compassion. And finally, well, it's better be finally for now. Is it better to receive? Is it better to give? Or if you're in need, is it better to receive? Surely it's better to receive. And if you think of both developmental and humanitarian aid as an institution across borders, as international practice, it's supply driven. Supply driven is something come up again as a name here in British politics, but not in that sense. It's supply driven. The aid system distributes what aid there is. Whether that's the aid that people need is another matter altogether. So the idea that it's better to give than to receive, it seems to be another concept that doesn't help either understanding international aid or improving it. And they're all mixed up together. So, is this new? No, it's not new. Was it always like this? Yes, I think it was. And just by chance, I'm not a scholar. Well, I'm a bit of a scholar, but I'm not enough of a scholar. And just by chance, I found that the language that we use today about international humanitarian assistance exists in Latin. Did you know that? I did try to, I was in Rome and I couldn't speak Italian, so I tried Latin, and I couldn't understand why nobody understood my Latin. Sorry, Sue, but my teacher was Scottish, and I was speaking Latin with a Scottish accent.
That's my excuse for why they don't understand me in Oxford.
Oh, well, beat them into understanding. So, but anyway, to go back to the Latin, I just noticed quite by chance that when the Romans were giving, at the end, when the Roman Empire was absolutely in decline, when it was giving aid to Goths, there was, Victor Turner, wonderful Victor Turner, came up with this concept of perennial speech. What is perennial speech? It's what people say, whether they believe it or not, when they think it's the right thing to say. Perennial speech is just one way of conceptualizing that, but I think it's a very neat and elegant way of doing so. But the point is that perennial speech has nothing to do with evaluation. It sounds very real, but it's not based on the study of either what was done or who benefited from it. So, I mean, there's a whole problem there. So if the problem goes right back to the very beginning, that's the earliest account I was able to find. Also, as I said, by chance, but it's the earliest account, 2,000 years plus ago, I was able to find of international humanitarian aid. And the language is perennial speech, just the same as today. So what does that mean for the future? I don't know, but I'll try and tell you next year. Thank you very much, everybody. It's really nice.
Thank you so much, Raymond. That's very much appreciated. For somebody who said they weren't at all prepared, of course, we do differently. You're always prepared. Always prepared. Thank you. Moving on to the next award, which is the Marsh Award for 22. The Marsh Prize is given to a person who's made a contribution to public life using anthropological ideas, but who is not themselves an academic. Dr. Juliet Bedford, whose work we honour this evening with the Marsh Prize, is just such a person. Dr. Bedford has a DPhil in social anthropology from Oxford University and has subsequently drawn on this training to apply anthropological ideas to global health. Juliet was the first anthropologist to be formally employed by the United Nations Mission for Ebola Emergency Response to West Africa in 2014. Her job involved integrating learning from anthropology into response strategies to make them more effective in halting the transmission of the virus, promoting early detection and reporting of symptoms, and encouraging early cure and treatment. Working with the Social Science and Humanitarian Action Platform, SSHAP, she went on to coordinate anthropological and other social science support during the response to Zika between 2016 and 2017. And she led SSHAP's response to the Ebola outbreaks in Equator Province and the North Kivu Province in DRC from 2018 to 2020. This involved drawing upon anthropological and other social science scholarships in such a way as to shape the world of DFID, now FCDO, UK SAGE, and the work of NGOs responding to the unfolding crisis in the Dominican Republic of the Congo, the DRC. She currently contributes to the WHO's Health Emergency Programme through the Strategic Technical Advisory Group for Infectious Hazards, and also provides strategic advice to the Centre for International Health Protection at the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin. This work comes together through a remarkable organisation that Dr. Bedford herself founded in 2008 called Anthropologica. Anthropologica is devoted to supporting public health emergencies in resource-constrained settings, that is, areas of the world where they have insufficient means to put into place, whether through reasons of poverty, warfare, or natural catastrophe, sufficient infrastructure to assure primary care. Anthropologica has gradually expanded until it is today a formidable body, one that can provide rapid and flexible responses across 4 continents. It is simply put one of the only international consultancies that has social anthropology at its core. Yet this does not mean that Dr. Bedford's arguing that only social anthropology can find answers to these questions. She's clear on the need for integration. Overall, Juliet's work has helped to build a strong evidence base for community-based approaches. She consistently and effectively demonstrates that interventions will only be effective when they are relevant, contextually appropriate, and co-owned by affected and at-risk populations, and when two-way trust between providers and populations is established and respected. She has argued persuasively that if we wait for the next pandemic to occur, it would already be too late, that we must have coordinated and sensible strategies in place to anticipate their occurrence. In short, that though we may be inspired by our own disciplinary area, as she herself has been, it is through sharing and pooling our expertise across identifiable themes, governance, engagement, ethics, and emerging technologies that we can be most effective. We cannot be sure that we will be able to cope effectively with the next pandemic or pandemics. We can, however, suggest that through Dr. Bedford's remarkable leadership and that of her team at Anthropologica, we may be in a better place to face up to them, wherever and whenever they should occur. Thank you. Now, someone's popped this in front of me. I'm assuming there's a reason. Perfect. I just wanted to make sure. Congratulations. I will leave that here for you, and I'm assuming you know how to do that.
We'll see, shall
I've got a
we?
green and a red, which is probably...
Thank you very much indeed. I have to say, as our other award winners have done this afternoon, it was a complete surprise and shock to receive the email about this award. And actually, the work that I have done is very collaborative, and it builds on a huge amount of effort from other applied social scientists and applied anthropologists who I've worked with over the years. So, as well as being incredibly grateful to receive this award myself, I have to admit that to have it from the Royal Anthropological Institute is somehow incredibly validating of the work that we do outside of academia. So thank you very much on behalf of my colleagues as well. I was asked to put together just a very short PowerPoint presentation as I was speaking today, so that's why I've got the clicker. But maybe just to start my 10 minutes, I should go back as well to a little bit of biography as to how we got here today. So I actually found anthropology through ethnomusicology. I did my undergraduate degree in music at the University of Oxford. And whilst my colleagues in our second year were staying in Oxford to study Mozart or Schoenberg or Stockhausen or whoever, I had no intention of staying in Oxford during the summer of my second year. So I went back to Malaysia, where I'd actually taken my gap year. And I spent 6 weeks in the rainforest in Peninsular Malaysia, working with the Orang Asli, who are the indigenous minority in Peninsular Malaysia, looking at how they use use music in their healing rituals. I went back to Oxford, I wrote it up, had to convince the department to accept it as an ethnomusicology thesis. They didn't quite know what to do with it. Where was the orchestration was a question I was asked frequently. And then by the time I'd finished my music degree, realized I was much more interested in the people and the culture and the society around music than I was in the music itself. And then sidestepped into anthropology and did a 2-year MPhil and then my PhD, my DPhil. And was incredibly lucky to have a lot of support as I was finishing my DPhil from a wide variety of colleagues at Oxford. You all know in this room that putting the word applied before anthropology is not always the most popular expression. But I was, I had Rodney Needham on one side, sort of challenging me at every step. And then I had colleagues like the wonderful Marcus Banks and Harvey Whitehouse as well, being incredibly encouraging on the other. So as I finished my PhD, as I finished my DPhil, I really felt that there was a very operational, a very applied aspect to everything that I had been learning, and felt that there was a real need within the arena of global health to try to bring some of the expertise, some of the knowledge, some of the approaches that we have as anthropologists to bear in terms of some of the world's big health problems. And that was really the nugget of the idea behind the Anthropologica. I thought I'd give it a couple of years, and if it didn't work out, I would come back somewhat sheepishly and go down a more sort of traditional postdoc route. But it went well. I spent the first 5 or 6 years of Anthropologica spending 5 or 6 months each year in the field, really trying to prove the concept, prove the model, refine some of the methodologies that we were using, and really trying to find a way to develop a strong evidence base, a really rigorous evidence base that then could be used to shape policy and programming on the ground, to try and improve the way that health interventions were rolled out, and ultimately to have a positive outcome on health impacts, which is obviously a very long and ambitious trajectory. But now we have 12 within our core team of Anthropologica. We work across 4 continents. We work remotely, which before COVID seemed to be a very dynamic way to work, and now everybody works that way. Since I founded Anthropologica in 2008, I believe that we've completed near to 150 different projects in over 80 countries around the world. And as well as doing sort of more traditional type-based consultancies where we have sort of a clear bounded project that we're doing, we also have developed long-term relationships with organisations like UNICEF, with WHO, WFP and others, INGO, Save the Children, Oxfam, where we can really feed into their research portfolio over time and be working very much hand in hand with these organisations to try and help build capacity and understanding around the use of social science. So as Anthropologica, we work across the development humanitarian nexus. We've just been doing a lot of COVID work, obviously, over the course of the last few years. And it's been fabulous in 2022 to actually be able to get back out into the field and be starting to do some of our sort of key projects again. So just to give you an idea, we're working at the moment on in Malaysia on birth registration for children affected by migration. We're just finishing a large project with UNICEF in Sierra Leone around health and nutrition for adolescents, where we're using really lovely creative participatory methods to include the adolescents in the research themselves. And really trying to find ways to project their voice into some of the discussions at the national level around their health and well-being. We've just finished a project in Côte d'Ivoire on a sex and gender-based analysis to do with vitamin A supplementation. So we have a very wide portfolio in terms of the type of work we do. But a lot of the work we've been focusing on, and I've been focusing on over the last few years, has been very much focused on public health emergencies and working in fragile states. I think we can all recognise that the Ebola outbreak in West Africa gave additional visibility or additional traction to the work that social scientists and anthropologists did. Anthropologists have worked within public health for decades and decades and decades, and we were very fortunate that we were able to build on that level of expertise. But the difference was that suddenly social science became relevant for people who weren't social scientists. And actually it was that interface that was both challenging, but was really exciting to be there and to be part of, in terms of how did we start to communicate and build a language and find a way to work not only on the medical side, but also with people who were very much focused on the operations of this kind of response structures as well. So I think you're probably all very aware that a lot of the work initially that we did was around safe and dignified burials. That to start with, the way that the burials were happening was a very medicalized approach. And it took a very long time for the response to shift in terms of their understanding from how do you dispose of a body so that it's medically safe, to actually doing a safe and dignified burial. And for anybody who knows, has cared for a loved one, who has been with a loved one during death and memorialized that loved one, that, you know, is an incredibly powerful, it's not just a point of time of what happens to that body, but it has implications for heritage, for future, for location, for identity. And so a lot of the work I was doing initially was really trying to convey some of those ideas, which I think to all of us in the room today are actually very obvious ideas, but how do you convey that to people who have never had to interface with this sort of community dynamic before? I have to recognise in this work, as you heard, I was deployed with the UN emergency mission. I think I was the first anthropologist to ever be deployed within a UN emergency mission, potentially the last. I don't think there's been another one since me. But I was very fortunate to be able to really work with a fantastic network of colleagues, including Melissa Parker, who's here today, and others, Melissa Leach at IDS, and others based in the US as well, to really try to look at what we knew about these communities, these affected and at-risk communities. What could we bring to bear in terms of the contextual knowledge that we already had, and look at how we meshed that with emerging issues on the ground that were being shaped not only by the virus itself and the transmission, but also being shaped by the response and the impact of the response too. Some other work that we did, I'll just touch on very briefly, was around mobility and the mobility of populations. We worked with UN Habitat. This is an aerial photograph I took in Liberia in the end of 2014, looking at the flow of communities in and out of central Liberia and central Monrovia. And we were able to map that on relationships with natal villages and actually use it as a predictor around certain events in terms of where we thought we would see a spike in transmission. This is a photograph I took in Wild Wharf in Freetown in Sierra Leone. You can see the quarantine rope around a house where some high-risk contacts had come out the day before. And really with this work, we were looking at too often response workers fall back on the key people that they see as influences in a society, be that a women's leader, a youth leader, the chief, all of whom are obviously very important. But in this sort of urban environment, which is an incredibly difficult environment, operating environment, where's the normal voice? Who are the other people who know who's going where, what's going on, what the relationships are? So how do you actually try to better understand this sort of very complex ecology and use that to help shape the response, rather than having a top-down level of a response that is trying to influence compliance over communities? And then how do you take that sort of urban environment and compare it with this, which is rural Cambia in Sierra Leone, and think about how you do contact tracing or surveillance? It's very different in these different types of environments. So again, bringing the anthropological lens to bear on some of the standard operating procedures. How do you localize them? How do you make them effective in these different operating contexts? And then on the back of the work that we did in West Africa, we were able to put together a really exciting platform, the Social Science and Humanitarian Action Platform, or SHAP, which is a tripartite relationship between IDS, the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, Anthropologica and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. We've now got funding. We're sort of in our third iteration of SHAP, and we've now got funding from the Wellcome Trust and from FCDO, which is allowing us a much more robust structure to really develop some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. So you can see here the 5 main sort of work streams that we're working towards, and I won't go into each one of those, but suffice it to say that with the evidence on demand workstream in particular, we're really able to pull together networks of anthropologists and other social scientists who have very long entrenched research expertise, either geographically focused or thematically focused. So with the response to Ebola in DRC, for example, when we were looking at some of the cross-border dynamics with Uganda, and some of the conflict-affected communities in North Kivu, we could really work with anthropologists and social scientists who had worked for decades in those areas. So how could we, again, really pull on what is already known and then mesh that with emerging issues on the ground? And we produced a series of briefs, which initially, back in the West Africa outbreak, we were quite criticised for as being reductionist. How could you take all this complexity and the sort of, you know, the Woody Allen-ness of being an anthropologist, where you're so reflexive, it's sort of almost painful to get anything else on paper. So how can you take that and put it down on, you know, 2 sides of A4? Well, I was lucky if I had 3 minutes with the senior leadership to give them some key points around the Safe and Dignified Burial Programme, around contact tracing. So really, beyond my own anthropological training, the hardest lesson that I've had to learn is how do you distill that down to different audiences, and how do you really advocate that and take responsibility when you know that some of the recommendations you could be making are actually going to have, hopefully, significant impact on the response and then on the communities that we're there to serve. And that term "serve," I think, comes back to what you were saying, Raymond. It's a fraught term. Just to close, I would say that we are currently working on the Ebola outbreak in Uganda. And in fact, Melissa and I were on a call about it just literally before we came into the room today. I think we have advanced such a lot since 2014. I no longer stand in rooms on my soapbox advocating for the role of social scientists and anthropologists in the response. Now, where a lot of our focus is how to do that in a coordinated fashion. So WHO, UNICEF, other response agencies, even within the national framework, so the National Task Force and the Emergency Operations Centre, they know that they want social science insights. So they will readily deploy anthropologists and other social scientists. But how do we do that in a coordinated way so that actually we're not duplicating efforts? We're not putting already very strained communities under additional pressure by having researchers go in and asking questions. How do we really work together as a whole to bring what we can to the table in terms of value add to help shape operations as they go forwards, and really link that in a very careful and considered way to trends in the outbreak? So to make sure that social science and anthropology isn't siloed within the risk communication and community engagement pillar of a response, but really that we're looking at trying to triangulate the sorts of data we work with epidemiological data, with surveillance data, so that we can help the response be agile and be reflexive over time. And that is what we're currently engaged in. So again, it's such a privilege to receive this award. I feel that I'm looking forward to now, past 3 o'clock on Tuesday the 18th, I'm going to be able to share this news with others. But really a huge thank you, not only from myself, as I said, but also from all of the colleagues that I've worked with over the last few years to really engage with anthropological insight and anthropological intelligence in the arena of public health emergencies. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Before we go into the final set of awards, I wondered if there were any questions that the audience might have at this time of our speakers. Anything that you would like to ask? Burning questions on your lips. This is where everyone goes shy and looks at their feet. There you go. Please, sister.
On a question, I just really want to thank everybody for their contributions and their deep thinking and the contributions they've made to highlighting the importance of our disciplines and wider society. So thank you, everybody. It's very kind. Thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
Not, she says, trying to do it seamlessly. Let's move on to the Public Anthropology Award. The RAI Public Anthropology Award is one of our newest prizes, offered in recognition of the profound commitment to the public communication of anthropological ideas that we hold as a discipline, that there is still more that we should achieve and that many colleagues have already forged a path in showing us the way forward. Dr. Rebecca Wragg Sykes studied as an undergraduate at the University of Bristol before gaining her BA in archaeology in 2003 and an MA in archaeology of human origins from the University of Southampton in 2004. Her doctoral thesis from the University of Sheffield, which examined evidence for late Neanderthals in Britain, was awarded in 2010. And following her PhD, Wragg Sykes was awarded a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Bordeaux, working on Neanderthal and prehistoric sites in the Massif Central Mountains. She's currently an honorary fellow at the University of Bordeaux and in the School of Archaeology, Classics and Egyptology at the University of Liverpool. Building on her academic background, Rebecca has illustrated great talent as a gifted communicator on prehistory in multiple ways. She has written for The Guardian, and I love the way people come in off scene. Just catch your eye. I'll start that again for me. Building on her academic background, Rebecca has illustrated great talent as a gifted communicator on prehistory in multiple ways. She has written for The Guardian and Scientific American and many others. She's appeared on history and science programs for BBC Radio 3 and Radio 4. She is a gifted artist and has created an extraordinary series of paintings inspired by ancient artifacts. She works with media companies, heritage institutions, academics and other bodies who would like to learn more about prehistory and the role of women within it. She's also a talented broadcaster, as in demand for a whole range of scientific festivals and other events. Her extraordinary talent for conveying what it may have been like to live so many thousand years ago is seen to great effect in her best-selling work, Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death and Art, which won the 2021 Current Archaeology Book of the Year award and has been favourably reviewed by Current Archaeology, London Review of Books, Nature, The Guardian and the New York Times. Yuval Noah Harari, author of Species, A Brief History of Humankind, writes that she has done a remarkable job synthesizing thousands of academic studies into a single accessible narrative. Dr. Wragg Sykes has shown us just how much and how varied and effective a single person can become in communicating anthropology successfully to the public. And it's with great pleasure now that we offer her the RAI's award and ask her to speak about her work. Please join us.
Oh, he's got the right one. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, there were about 10 different PowerPoints on that key, so I'm quite glad he's found the right one. Yeah, like everybody else, it was a huge surprise to actually, be sent an email suggesting that I might have sort of be joining you all today and receiving an amazing award. So I'm just incredibly grateful for that. And I do feel rather in awe and humbled given everybody else that's spoken today and the relative length of my career versus many of you. So it's quite amazing to be here. So thank you very much indeed. So the talk that I want to do really is just really not too deep, but kind of go through a little bit of my own sort of history and journey in working in archaeology, and eventually seguing into public work on this. I don't know whether we should turn the lights off because I'm not sure we can see some of my pictures. Is that possible to turn the lights off in here? Is there a switch? There probably isn't, is there? Okay, so oops, hang on, I've got my timer. Okay, thank you. Right, that's better, isn't it? Okay, so Prehistory Matters is kind of a little bit of a play on sort of what I think prehistory does actually matter, and also the matters of how I have reached prehistory and what I do. So yeah, so my origins, what's my actual background, and we had a little bit of an introduction, but so you could say maybe I started this journey when I got my PhD, which was 12 years ago, which is not very long in terms of some of the eminent careers of other people here today. Or maybe my career and my interest in archaeology started on my first excavation, which was actually a Roman site when I was 16 in that picture. But similarly, I also come from London. I was digging around in my back garden in London when I was young, so it goes back a bit further. Or it could go back even further. So this is yes, we can't really see it well. This is a drawing I did when I was about 9. I was one of those weird archaeologists that likes dead stuff, and I was into collecting animal bones, and so I had a skull of a rabbit and a sort of a really decayed skull of a rabbit, and I was making the taphonomic distinction, a very new rabbit skull and a very old rabbit skull. So yeah, this sort of, I guess it goes right back for me. But to come forward, and this is similar to what the last speaker said, this award, it's wonderful to have this as a personal thing, but also bringing me to where I am and the work that I do now are many other people, and I certainly want to acknowledge some of the women in particular who've been inspirational to me, and this began during my undergraduate studies. So we have Professor Kate Robson-Brown. Can I do a laser? And it doesn't really work on the screen. So she's on the left there, Kate Robson-Brown. She's a human origins specialist at Bristol. So I did my BA at Bristol. Nicoletta Momigliano at the top, another professor there. She worked in Mediterranean and classical archaeology. And then on the right, that's me on my graduation with Dr. Tamar Hodas, who was working then on Iron Age Mediterranean archaeology. And I think you guys will probably recognize the person at the bottom, who I know won the same award a couple of years ago. But I actually met Alice because she was at Bristol when she was doing her anatomy work, and she used to come and do the very intro lectures on the human origins course, sort of talking us about deep time tetrapod anatomy and early hominins. So all of these people were an influence. And then, yes, I carried on my academic journey, went deeper into academia and deeper into time as well. So I started in Roman things, and then in my undergraduate phase, I began to realize I quite liked the really old things. And so for my master's, I went and specifically wanted, I was offered to do an MPhil at Oxford, but I actually chose to go to Southampton because it was a teaching course. It was a master's with teaching, and I really wanted to be trained in stone tool analysis. And at the time, that was one of the only two places that offered that. And so Southampton have and had and still have an amazing course in teaching you very hands-on how to work with stone tools and the technology, how we actually analyze this. That was wonderful. And so the image down there on the bottom right is one of my colleagues, Nick Taylor. So this is us back in the day in 2003, struggling with this experimentally knapped collection of stones, which is what they use to teach you. And they kind of give you lots of ideas and then say, right, go and analyze all that. And so that's what you have to do for a few months. And yeah, that was great. And Nick now is extremely sort of advanced in his career. He's worked on the site with the oldest known anywhere stone tools now from Africa. So that's 3.3 million year old. So he's also done very well. But two other people who were very influential is the picture at the top right there, now Professor John McNabb, and at the bottom left there is Professor Clive Gamble. And I was extremely fortunate to be taught by both of those individuals as well. Very inspirational in different ways, actually. So that was very formative. And then I went and did my PhD at Sheffield. And as was said in introduction, I worked on the later Neanderthal archaeology. So that's 60,000 years to 40,000 as opposed to the older stuff. And I spent a lot of time going around many museums because much of the archaeology from that period was excavated in Victorian times, when philanthropists thought it was lovely to send a few bits here and there to all museums around the country, which is actually extremely annoying when you want to go and sort of make a synthetic study of that. So I ended up going to about 23 different museums and saw a lot of train stations. But again, also there at Sheffield, I had the wonderful experiences of being able to dig at Cresswell Crags. There was an excavation happening there, and we were sort of reanalyzing the Victorian spoil heaps, but in the process found an undisturbed cavity, which was rather amazing. I also went to South Africa, and that was fantastic as a means of sort of opening horizons on a different archaeological record. And again, just something that made that really powerful for me was the PhD community more broadly at Sheffield. And when I was there were about 50 PhD students. It was very, very big as a graduate school, and being able to work alongside people who were studying all kinds of different things, not just prehistory, but many different things, was really important in making me question some of my assumptions and giving me a richer view on archaeology, and it's in particular on theory. Actually, we started a theory discussion group, and the person I'm sitting next to there in that right hand picture, Christina Soraki, she is I think she's at Leicester now, but she is a ground stone specialist and has worked on Çatalhöyük, in fact, and sort of many other sites. So that was sort of really part of the the formative aspects of my training archaeologically. And then after that, I was very lucky, and this is kind of where like luck kind of comes in as a theme actually, because you know, sometimes things happen and they don't happen because of serendipity, and you're not quite sure about where to go in your career. So after my PhD, I was working, well, I was actually doing what lots of people now do, which is you spend 2 years writing 50 applications for jobs and grants, you don't get any of them. So I was working in a volunteer capacity on a project in Jersey with colleagues at La Côte de Saint-Brelade, which is a very famous Neanderthal site. Some of you might know this. And I applied for a Marie Curie fellowship, which is part of the European funding framework, encouraging people to move between countries, and I didn't get it. And was thinking about, okay, what am I going to do? And then 4 months later, I was told I was on the reserve list. Out of like the whole of Europe, they have a reserve list, and I was ranked 6th on the reserves. So 6 people above me didn't take their fellowships for whatever reason, and I'm very grateful because that meant I could actually take it a year later. So that's kind of my sort of strange luck and everything like that. So I went to France, and it was a 2-year fellowship, and they're very short, the Marie Curies, quite intensive. And while I was there, so I was working at Passé Laboratory, very, very well-known prehistory, especially for the Paleolithic in Bordeaux. And I was working on a project there with colleagues actually based in the Massif Central in the southeast. So a lot of stone tool analysis, and we did some project work, but nothing sort of, for various reasons, just I didn't sort of get a big publication at the end of that, so it was kind of a little bit sort of uncertain where I was going to go. But I did produce something else while I was in France, which was 2 children. So this is on my excavation with what's now my eldest daughter. But I put this in because actually I think this is just as formative for me in a professional sense as well as a personal sense, and it made me revisit some of my own assumptions and prejudices about how one can be a professional archaeologist and how one can manage career and interests, but also how your personal experiences then intersect your own interpretations of archaeology and anthropology. So I think actually that was very significant for many reasons. Talking of women and having sort of perceptions changed and things, something else that was kind of going on at the same time as this during my PhD, during my postdoc, was the emergence of a project called Trowel Blazers, which I co-founded with 3 other women there, so Suzanne Pilar-Birch, Victoria Herridge and Brenna Hassett. And so this was in 2012, so 10 years ago. We were essentially early career people, sort of in our first postdoc type thing. And through luck and serendipity and just connections, we came together via social media. So let it not be said, nothing good comes from Twitter. And what we sort of accidentally created in a way was a project, a public communications project to promote the contributions of women in archaeology and the other earth sciences, geology and paleontology. And initially it began, well, in a light-hearted way, but it began with us kind of wanting to produce a resource that was easily accessible for people, where you could say, well, who are the archaeologists who are women, and go on a resource and sort of see pictures, interesting pictures and small biographies. So we began like that, but it kind of evolved. And so we shifted away from, maybe you guys don't remember Tumblr, it's a little bit like Instagram, but an old rubbish version of it. So we started with that. It was very visual. So it was like Instagram, it's about images. But we found actually from the start, people wanted to submit biographies about women they knew about or women that they worked with. And so we realized actually we needed more capacity to have text, to have, you know, real stories about women and information. So we shifted to a proper website, which is where the project is right now. And so this is sort of another thread that's carried on for the past 10 years with me, and we've done all sorts of different things which I and the other women that run this are, you know, very, very proud of the things that we've managed to do. For example, we worked with a toy company to create a age-appropriate doll or action figure, which is a fossil hunter Lottie, she was called, and that was a contender in the Toy of the Year Awards, this World Toy Industry thing. So that was amazing. So she has all like she has a hammer and a trowel and information about fossils and information about other women paleontologists in her little backpack. But we also have done other things. We've done a lot of work with different organisations, exhibition work, National Trust, other people. And we also had a wonderful project with an artist, Lenora Saunders, who approached us with an idea for a photographic exhibition where she wanted to show women, modern women, posing or in the guise of very important women from the past in archaeology. So we created that. But we also, some of you might recognise that textbook, Renfrew and Barn, the archaeology textbook. We managed to actually sort of get an entire chapter of that rewritten to not have women in the little boxes, but have them integrated into the text like everyone else. So this is kind of the work that we did and are doing. And this is just some of the images from that exhibition, Raising Horizons. So we had wonderful photo shoots. We had the launch for that in the Geological Society, and then it was actually featured in the centenary of the women's vote at the Speaker's House. We were invited to go and show some of the portraits. So that was absolutely wonderful, and that was a real moment of energy to be in that room with just, I don't know, 100 women, and everybody just completely buzzing, and you know, everybody sharing their expertise and their experiences. It was wonderful. And yeah, so kind of moving to more recent and continuing work that I'm doing. So it was mentioned in the introduction to me that part of what I do now is focused a lot on writing and communicating about archaeology broadly, but also Neanderthals specifically. So I was very lucky to, while I was sort of finishing my postdoc and not quite sure where I was going to go or what I was going to do after this, I was able to stay in France for a couple of years, and I had a contract for a book already. Very, again, serendipity, because that came through Twitter as well. The publishers approached me. And so I was writing this just before I came back to the UK at the end of 2017, and had to finish that during the beginning of the pandemic, and yeah, completely surprisingly and amazingly, it came out and received incredibly positive response from just the wider sort of community, but also most, I think, powerful for me is the responses I've had from just members of the public. I've had hundreds of emails from people who have read the book, who are not necessarily sort of people who are really into archaeology or prehistory, but they picked it up, were interested, and found an emotional connection actually with the deep past that they had not experienced. But also I've had some very kind messages and responses and reviews from colleagues as well, who, I can't think of a better compliment when somebody says, "Oh, I've put that on my teaching syllabus for the students." You know, that's that's really quite wonderful. And so this is kind of where I am. I don't like to say I've left academia. I like to say I am beyond just being in academia. I still have a toehold in academia. I have an honorary fellowship at the University of Liverpool, which means I can still collaborate with colleagues. I can work on projects together with them, so that's wonderful. But I also get to do a lot of other amazing stuff, which I'm really, really passionate about as well. So this actually was me last week, or no, about 3 days ago, in Italy for the Italian edition of the book was a shortlistee for a science writing prize. So I'm standing in the room where Galileo used to speak at the University of Padua. So, but this was very important because it was a prize that's established in Italy to promote science, but also just general public education. And what I loved about this prize is that they have a scientific jury which selects books from about 100 books, but then the actual judging is done by students. They have more than 100 students from different universities, and they're the ones that actually vote and get to make the decisions. So I really liked that sort of aspect of that that competition. And I do a lot of other stuff, as was said. You know, I am always sort of honoured to be asked to talk publicly about not only Neanderthals, who I can always speak about, but archaeology more broadly. And I do still publish academically, so this is a chapter that came out this year, sexual behaviour in Neanderthals, which is remarkably hard to be sure about, but there's also quite a lot you can say. So I do that. And also now another way of doing this, like this sort of communicating and sharing with people about archaeology. I work with New Scientist magazine, and I have set up with them archaeological tours in France, helping people visit Neanderthal sites and giving them like a deep understanding of Neanderthal archaeology. So that was in June. We're going into caves. And also I'm working with different museums. So this is at the Neanderthal Museum in Germany. This was the actual launch of the German edition of the book, but I'm working with them in other ways in a consultancy role as well. And this is very exciting because the ability to sort of present fresh views in museums is incredibly important. So just to finish, you know, this where I sort of come from and the things that are important to me and that have allowed me to sort of have done the things I've done. I've had incredible support from the beginning, and things that I think are important whenever you do public work is expertise and training, and that cannot be devalued. To have inspirational individuals who are there and mentor you and support you, and on whose shoulders you stand. And in particular, the University of Sheffield, I do want to point out that as one of the top departments in this country and very high ranked, it's quite shocking that that was threatened with immediate closure, and it still is under threat now. How on earth the colleagues there can plan research or anything else when they still have a threat of everything being shut down in only 2 years is quite crazy. So yeah, that's not great. And just sort of coming through all of these different ideas about having time and the ability to find out where you want to go and the opportunity to follow things you're passionate about. And yeah, luck and serendipity does play a real part in that, which leads me to be able to do things like this in September, which was as part of these archaeological tours to do wine tastings in a cave, which frankly, there's harder things that one could do. So no, all of these things are important. And just the final slide really is to come back to the topic, which is, you know, why does prehistory matter? Why does what I'm doing, why is it important? Well, first of all, the Neanderthals in a way just won a Nobel Prize, so there is a massive interest in this subject more broadly, and why it's of interest and relevance to people are fundamentally about identity. And this is one of the, I think, issues that are facing us more broadly in society right now. There is a lot of worrying schisms and sort of attempts to push people apart, not just in this country, but in other countries. And prehistory is one of the things that's really powerful, actually, I think, in sort of avoiding that and bringing people together and helping people recognize what we share. Obviously, the climate crisis also connects to this, the whole themes about extinction and everything. And yeah, just understanding where we come from and thinking about different ways that we can be together and make a difference. So I sort of connected this to also thinking about how we work professionally in museums and obligations and duties that museums have as well. And this was relating to oil divestment in terms of funding and things like that. So that is my journey, and thank you very much for this incredible honour, and yeah, thank you.
Take that.
Thank you very
much indeed. Thank you. Thank you so much indeed. I'm going to keep us moving on at a pace now to our final award, which is the RAI President's Lifetime Achievement Award. This award is given to an academic anthropologist who's made a profound impact throughout their career, and there could be no more fitting a candidate than Professor Dame Marilyn Strathern, who's known far and wide as an outstanding scholar, and one too who has had a profound impact in bolstering and furthering social anthropology. Marilyn Strathern read anthropology and archaeology in Girton College, Cambridge, obtained her PhD in 1968. She then became a researcher for the New Guinea Research Unit of the Australian National University, followed by a stint from 1976 to 1983, when she was a lecturer at Girton College, and then Trinity College from 1984 to 1985, occasionally making guest lectures at the University of California in Berkeley, in the United States, in Europe, and in Australia. She left Cambridge to become Professor of Social Anthropology at Manchester University in 1985. And she then returned to Cambridge for the final time in 1993 to take the position of the William Wise Professor of Social Anthropology until her retirement in 2008. During this time, she also held the position of Mistress of Girton College from 1998 to October of 2009. This simple summary of her career, formidable though it is, hardly does justice to her astonishing contribution to the field of anthropology. Her work has been a continual theoretical inspiration, including such works as Partial Connections, The Gender of the Gift, Kinship at the Core, and After Nature, which have each in turn opened up new fields of inquiry. This has been combined with an extraordinary devotion to the successive younger generations, particularly to the difficulties of women attempting to pursue a career before the battle for gender equality was properly achieved. If today we're approaching gender parity in leading positions in anthropology, then it's largely because of the efforts of Professor Strathern throughout her career. It would be nevertheless entirely wrong to imply that she was only willing to support women. Rather, she has had an instinctive desire to help all those who are struggling or attempting to realise their potential in their careers, and she would go to endless pains in order to assist them in doing so. This combination of thoughtfulness, devotion, and creativity is extremely unusual and has been acknowledged in the awarding of no less than 8 honorary doctorates, the mastership of her college, and a DBE. It is surely appropriate that we now, at the RAI, acknowledge what has been an astounding contribution to the discipline. Marilyn Strathern. Julie, oh, looks like there's a clicker up here. Does that for you? No. Excellent.
I first of all just have to say, I've been listening with huge admiration to the previous speakers and everything that they've been doing beyond the university. But this, I'm afraid, is sort of, meanwhile, back at the ranch. President, Director, colleagues, thank you for your very kind words, Dame Sue and the RAI, for the honour of this award. Not to speak of the pleasure of receiving it at an arena enlivened by being at once in person and more remotely accessible. My thanks are as inclusive as I can make them. Now I'm going to overcome that dreadful impulse of the aged to joke about longevity in the face of its imminent truncation, at the moment, theoretically speaking, I hasten to add, and recover the spirit of this award. I can't convey how uplifting it was to hear that while writing was mentioned in the original citation, the RAI also had in mind teaching, administration, and nurturing. And I shall take these in a larger sense, if I may. Teaching especially pleases me because although I wasn't terribly good at lecturing, certainly not by today's standards, teaching doesn't stop at the end of the lecture. On the contrary, I've always been impressed that students take away what is already their own version, and in these reflections, in effect, carry on the teaching in the learning that they do, whether over a short or in fact over very long time spans. And of course, it can come from what might seem the most informal and incidental of encounters outside the classroom. Now, I've been fortunate to have been part of a strong seminar tradition where the distinction between teaching and learning could not be pinned to any one interchange or indeed to any particular role. I've never forgotten a student voice that raised itself at the end of an early paper of mine on the joys and otherwise of audit culture, as it was in the 1990s, to remind us academics of the examinations at the centre of our own auditing practices. And she was right, of course. Which leads to administration. It's not only heads of department who administer, although it did seem to me a lengthy stint at the time, 8 years in Manchester, then 5 in Cambridge, but in fact is the lot of any academic. Here the issue is not so much dovetailing, as in teaching and learning, but treading a fine line between being efficient in terms demanded by the institution and retaining a critical approach to what seemed administration's ever-increasing appropriation of staff time and energy. And I've only admiration for what academics cope with today, especially against the background of insecurity and precarity. But to turn it around, institution building can also be creative. A personal incident from the late 1990s, sitting on a platform with the Vice-Chancellor of Manchester University and the chairman of what was then Granada Television at the inauguration of the Granada Centre for Visual Anthropology in the Social Anthropology Department. Now, the work leading up to this was not mine, nor indeed theirs, but we were a symbolic triad. At that instant, I was the possibility of the new centre. And if the university regarded it as enabling their outreach to the city, so too the Granada Corporation entertained precisely the same vision of outreach to the city, a wonderful moment of bureaucratic symbiosis between them. Now, nurture is a lovely term to bring up in the context of academic endeavour in the broadest sense. I know that in the long period between getting my PhD in 1968 and going to Manchester in 1985, filled as it was with activity, including residence and research in Papua New Guinea, editing the RAI's journal, and undergraduate supervision for Girton College, I sometimes felt something was lacking. Although circumstances had brought one notable PhD student my way, I frankly envied those who taught students across the whole range. Things then changed, and looking back, I realized just how lucky, and echo the previous speaker, and because I don't underestimate the luck, how lucky I was to become part of a system that was then still expanding, because it meant the subject was also expanding, and it was inspiring to be working with students of all kinds who helped expand it. Anyway, I felt institutionally as well as personally nurtured, as I had been as an undergraduate, with Esther Goody as my second year supervisor and Audrey Richards in the third year. But there's also what I'd like to call scholarly nurture. This is the extent to which studying, research, and reflection are as much social as intellectual activities. Obviously, as a subject, social anthropology lends itself to such an outcome. We are forever circulating our thoughts through those of others with lesser or greater congruence, as indeed our interlocutors above all remind us. I once suggested to a Papua New Guinean colleague that perhaps his acumen and flair for academic debate might have had something to do with the oratorical traditions that his people were famous for. Of course not. He put it down to the excellent mission schooling he had had. That social and intellectual relations often flow together doesn't guarantee the accuracy or pertinence of the results, but it does give the discipline a distinctive ethics that could also be called nurture. Both require care. This could be put more loosely as an analogy. One must attend to conceptual contexts as one attends to social contexts, except that anthropological-ethnographic inquiry may well throw both into question, and the one becomes a source of critique for the other. There is nothing like fieldwork to query one's analytical vocabulary while affording the very reason for deploying it. I've spent some time recently musing on one of anthropology's central constructs in this regard, relations themselves. What has been so powerful for the discipline, holding intellectual and social relations in tandem, also has its limitations. But there is a further issue about one's own milieu. If taking care of the anthropological endeavour entails criticising the English vernacular relation for its conceptual inadequacies, this does not imply that, as a vernacular person, so to speak, I don't care deeply about relations. The issue, what works for analysis, doesn't necessarily work in other registers. I've known for a long time. It was a lesson learned just after I'd written my first book on Mount Hagen in Papua New Guinea and gender came on the scene. The women's liberation movement was inspirational for what became feminist anthropology, even though the important work that their generic concept of subordination was doing did not mean it could simply be picked up as a term of analysis. Rather, to take care of one's relation to both the political movement and the academic enterprise, one had to run with both registers. Women in Between was the title of that first book, and Hagen women were adept at running with different registers. Indeed, they were released, so to speak, from an ideological need to produce the kind of overarching account of the world in which their male counterparts invested. In fact, one of men's complaints was that unlike their own steadfastness, women were always of many minds. At the time, I observed that their sisters and wives did not make contrary assertions with such cogency, and I wrote, they half, although only half, agreed with what the men said. That was 50 years ago this year. I feel I've been blessed with colleagues, students, critics, and with a discipline whose distinctive engagement of minds means that teaching, learning, and nurture flow through relations with people and their social milieu in ways one could never otherwise have imagined. My thanks indeed are as inclusive as I can make. Thank you.
It's quite heavy.
So what's in here? What's in here?
We're going to have a look now.
Yes, yes, of course. Take it out.
You want me to take it out? Oh, okay.
Please. Oh, golly.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Right.
How to serve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mel.
Thank you so
Thank you so much. Thank you. David's going to be so impressed with me. It's 5 to 5. You want to be finished by 5 o'clock. We're close. We're close. Thank you very much to everybody for this afternoon and for your words that have inspired, for the amount of support that our friends and our colleagues give to the RAI. It is always such a pleasure to see everybody in the room. Could I ask, please, if there is any other business to be undertaken this afternoon? And if not, it leaves me to say that the Curl Lecture will be given this evening in the next half an hour by Dr. Maxime Bramy, who has been joined by his family. You're very, very welcome. We're looking forward to the lecture enormously, and it gives us an opportunity just to get up and stretch legs a little bit whilst we move the room around. It has been an honour and a pleasure to serve as the president of the Royal Anthropological Institute for the last 4 years. I hope there will never be another president who ever has to live through a pandemic associated with any organisation. But all I can say is the way in which this institution has been exemplary. I can only thank the director, David, to thank Amanda, who just, I don't know how, keeps the place running, but absolutely does, Fiona, and to Christine, and to all the staff of the RAI, of whom we are enormously proud. Thank you to my colleagues who work on the council with us, and I wish my every best to our new president, our incoming president, Professor Debbie Swallow, who starts probably tomorrow, I suspect. Yes, oh, David's nodding, so that's a yes, please expect. Thank you very much indeed. The meeting is now closed.